as a visiting artistic fellow at the Churchill College. You returned to Perth recently as a full fellow of Churchill College and with a professorship next year at Kenyon College, the Liberal Arts and Writing College in the USA. What does this incredible transformation of your life mean to you?
Well, I'm wondering what it's a transformation from. Well, I'm still a writer. That's what I went as. My academic life has sort of grown somewhat. I hope it's not at the expense of my writing life. I like the two to work together. What does it mean? It means a lot of possibilities are available. I can do things that I couldn't do before. I'm very interested in kind of facilitating dialogue between very different areas of thought. And these positions actually allow me to do that. They allow me to bring people in, for example, from Australia, writers and academics, to Cambridge in Britain. It allows me to create sort of movement between Britain, Australia and the States. So yeah, the only difference is that I can do more things. I can realise more projects. Whereas before, I might have had ideas and so on, but I lacked the kind of backing. Though with SALT, which has been running for over a decade, I managed to make that work without any institutional backing, and I'm pretty proud of that. But still, it allows me to do more.
Well, I think that recently you were mentioned in the Times Literary Supplement as one of the leading Australian poets. That is, you are really hot property. As a dramatist also, as a theorist, a publisher and a public reader. A lot of British, American, European and Australian universities would be very glad to host you, yet you have chosen Edith Cowan University as your home state, your home place, and this is for a special association in future. Why is this?
Well, Edith Cowan's an interesting university in the sense that it actually does have quite a long history, but it's perceived as being a new university, therefore it's got flexibility. And I hope that it can actually do things that, say, older, more established, set in their ways, universities might not be able to do. The kind of interfacing between different fields, be it visual arts, media, literature, and so on. I think that that's what's exciting about it. All these components are important. It's in Western Australia. It's on the west coast. It's seen as a growth area in terms of theory and ideas, that there may be potential here. And that excites me, that it's not bound down by certain preconceptions. Maybe it is, I don't know. But certainly people see it that way from outside, and I think that's good. Yeah, it's potentially vigorous. It has incredible potential, and I think that to create something, at the moment I'm working on this international landscape and language centre, and there's potential to create contacts right around the world and bring people into a dialogue over how we look after our environment, how we talk about space and geography, and so on. And what better place than somewhere as large and varied as Western Australia, and in the context of this place.
Watershed is a recent collaborative project that you and I have worked on. It came out of an earlier work we did, which we called Aveneering. It's a project that perhaps you'd like to enlarge upon, where it's going to go from here.
Yeah, well, as you say, it was originally called Aveneering. The idea was to explore the Avon catchment, because both of us have associations through family with the place. Speaking personally, I have a very uneasy and uncomfortable relationship with the place. It's a place I love, and as Lao Tzu says, the further you move away, the closer you get. Even if I'm in Britain, I think about it constantly and I write about it. But it's uncomfortable because I feel a very strong sense of it's also not my place, that I'm an intruder, that Indigenous people have been not only removed, dispossessed, process of dispossession, but in many cases genocided. So there's a kind of I have a collective responsibility in terms of someone who has family there and who live on the land, to actually talk about these issues in a non-appropriative way, but in a way that I can speak. How much right do I have to be there? This is questionable. So that's a point of interest for me in coming to grips with this, because the family is there, and I am there sometimes. And how does one work through these issues and open dialogue with Indigenous people, these kind of issues? Also, it's a visual thing. It's about seeing. It's about the way we see different spaces. I see the Avon area, the watershed, if you like, in a very different way now for having lived overseas and having lived in a very different environment, the Fens environment of Cambridgeshire, very flat, very low, waterlogged, has some similarities with parts of the Avon, but also great differences. And it allows you to see the place closer in a more detailed way. And so that's what the project for me is about. It's rediscovering place, it's about seeing place in a different way, and it's about dealing with major issues that in a sense almost can't be reconciled, though in some, I do believe in reconciliation, but how we move towards that respectful process of reconciliation with Indigenous people.
The proposed International Centre for Landscape and Language is a very exciting concept for this university. How do you see its establishment and its future development?
Well, it's been talked about for many, many years by people such as yourself and others, and you and I have been talking about it for a couple of years now. It's really set in, if you like, over the last couple of months. A lot of work's been done, and connections with other universities such as Cambridge and Kenyon College and European universities and so on and so on. The list is quite long, have been established. These links have been established. The idea of actually providing a forum in which very different disciplines, whether it's environmental studies, as I said, the visual arts or media or whatever, and I mean, in a sense, our interaction now is very, very much part of what we're trying to achieve. This kind of interaction comes out of a movement between very different disciplines, is what's exciting. The 2 months of working on it have been very high-powered because of this enthusiasm, because of this excitement and interest, not only from overseas institutions, but institutions from within Australia, where you normally would have backbiting, maybe too strong a word, I don't know, but indifference. Competition, that's the word. That's the word. Between institutions, there seems to be a great deal of support for this, and a desire for, in other institutions who have worked in this area in landscape and language, to actually seg you into what we're doing and to interact with us. And this goes right across the board. It's not in the institutions, but writers, environmentalists, and so on. So this has many faces. So I think it will be very constructive. So the connections have been sorted out in the last 2 months, and the infrastructure's slowly being put in place, the admin infrastructure, which is extremely important. I think that we've got to realise that these things don't exist in thin air, and that they're as much about sitting in front of the computer and filing the emails and filling the letters in and so on, as they are about the creative side of it. So the nuts and bolts are being put together, and the centre will attract, hopefully all being well, students and people from overseas, and generate an income as well, so it can look to doing incredible projects, publishing and online journals and exchange of scholars and Avon Valley projects, that kind of thing.
John, you're familiar with a very interesting project that was produced here in this media production centre at Edith Cowan University called Landscape and You, a project that Judith Dinham and I initiated. In fact, you were involved in this project.
Hit in Cambridge, incidentally.
That's right, yes. And what place do you think television production ought to have in the future of the International Centre for Landscape and Language?
It's essential. As I've said very clearly from the beginning, that I believe that all the individual kind of areas, not only of the university, but of normal daily interaction, are imperative to make this work. Landscape's a very visual thing, and we live in an age of media, and how we actually perceive the place we live in is very much mediated by the camera and by the production and so on and the presentation of geographies and interactions. So yeah, I don't think you can separate it off. We don't live in the 19th century. I mean, that would be interesting, but we don't. But then the 19th century was the sort of age of the camera, and that would have been essential as well. You just can't separate it off. So landscape, the landscape series that you did was particularly interesting when some of it was showed in Cambridge. and various colleges leapt up and said, we need copies of this. What they liked about it, we're talking about a place with one of the great libraries of the world, a repository library where nearly every book ever published in most languages exists. It's an astonishing place. Just love the idea of getting hold of these because you can't, it's the process of witnessing. The camera witnesses. Now, it may tell lies because of this mediation process, but it's still part of a witnessing thing. So you have your book, you have your text, and you have the camera as well to witness. And you need the two together. And you also need a few paintings, and you need a few computer graphics, and so on. So these things are all part of the big picture.
Well, the landscapes where you work now at Cambridge University are very flat fenlands close to the North Sea. It seems strange that you could get this sort of inspiration or even find them productive for your own work as a writer as compared to your familiar wheatlands landscapes of Western Australia.
But difference enhances, it's the differences that make you see more clearly. What's metaphor made up of? It's made up of things that are very disparate. You bring them together and you get a kind of, if you like, a third idea out of it, or maybe fourth and fifth and sixth idea if it's a good one. So being in a very supposedly different landscape actually enhances the way I see each. But there are great similarities between linguistically, and also the way people perceive of their space as being separate and different. Western Australians are still a major secessionists, I think, in Australia. Fenlanders are like that, totally. There's parts of swamp Perth, and someone like Dr. Gibbler here, who's done a lot of work on the wetlands of Western Australia, would find very strong correlations with the wetlands of the fens. There are universal truths at work in landscapes that are affected by water, obviously, and lack of water. So even though most of the Western Australia I'm familiar with is in fact very dry, it's that difference that really clarifies, as I said. So no, I think it's actually helped the way I see generally.
Well, perhaps out of your 25 published books, you could find just something that you could read, which illustrates the work you've been able to do in those new landscapes, John.
Okay, I'll probably read something from Visitants. This is a new book. It's about the processes of intrusion, and where we can be and where we can't be, and where we end up, maybe we shouldn't be, that kind of thing. Now, this book is was entirely written in Britain. It's largely about Australia. In fact, almost entirely. But what is interesting is that that way of seeing that's been affected by the landscape of the fens comes through in the poem. So even though it's not literally about the fens, it's got a sense of the lessons I've learned. I'll read one poem. It goes for a couple of pages. It's called "The Road to Brookton," and the subtitle is "On the Nature of Memory." And there's all sorts of words worthy and overtones there. And it's actually dedicated to a Cambridge scholar, John Kerrigan, who's an Irishman brought up in Liverpool, a Liverpool Irishman. And so his sense of displacement and so on is one I can interact and relate with. Now, already we have a direct correlation that, of removal. Now, in this poem, I came back to Australia. In fact, it was not that long before we did our first Aventuring tour. It was the journey before I came back, and my brother, who's a shearer, took Tracy and myself, also just myself, I can't remember, I think I came down on my own, in fact, out to Brookton. And this is what came about, the road to Brookton. Back from England and Fenland, we drive into the wheat belt. Warm weather with the possibility of a storm later in the day. Or maybe it is cool, but warm when compared with where we've come from. Breaching the hills, reservoirs and quarries that feed the city, the excursion reconstructs itself, everlastings thick on roadsides broadcast ethnographies and genealogies, preparing for their seed drop. A dried, persistent thought withering and flaking like insect wings, blown into the cautiously drying crop, awaiting reconstitution. Movement plays like a home video. The crops and road-killed animals compile as data, memory as web crawler hyperventilating references. The Ure looks okay from here. That roo is still alive, gasping for its last breath on the road's gravel shoulder. There's gelatin in this Kodak film. The sky's too bright, glistens and gleams like a cyberchrome print. They imported convict labour late in the picture. Land rights are up against it around here. This state voted for secession in the 30s. Was this one of the roads resurfaced with a federal grant during the bicentennial year? A landmark defines itself. Granite outcrop or gnarled tree in a very flat field fringed by fire breaks. A UFO was spotted hovering over a field of Gamenia wheat last year. That's what we heard. A little to the west, the face of Christ made an appearance on a slab of stone, looking medieval and European. In a letter, on the telephone, a scrap of gossip loose in memory. It was, well, whatever, old technology. The new model goes quickly out of date. General Motors, Ford, Nissan. I was reading Kropotkin and thinking about Sidney Nolan. We pass a beer can, a bullet-ridden milepost, a broken fan belt. Radio waves lasso the culture. The bright renderings, tarps on field bins, on truck trailers, glow authentically, and we have our say. It's true, there's a water bird on the edge of scrub eating carrion. Dead sheep or roo. It's the recollection that reeks. It seems logical at the time, as if it had come to this or that. Between the properties, Crown land sticks out like a sore thumb. The shells of burnt-out cars, confused spotter planes and satellites. A total fire ban is close. We listen for the news. Overtaking something is missed. A dam brines beneath the billowing stratosphere. Bitumen wavers. Brookton moves closer. A creek shadows the highway, unmapped, so there's hope for dialect. The locals sleep away their Sunday. Lightning stirs up heat and recall grows oppressive. All tenses and figures of speech, sulphur-crested white cockatoos lift with Hitchcockian malevolence, as if they shouldn't be there, as if placid crows perched on second-hand farm machinery and rusted swings under wandoo trees have conspired and incited them. Caught out, struck down by the suddenness of the storm, we imagine that we're part of it, that we belong there too, knowing in the electric air that this is not true. I got a genealogy instead of a genealogy in there, but basically.
John, in a recent book of essays about you called Fairly Obsessive, Peter Minter, one of the contributors, has said this about your work, I quote, "By destabilising notions of generic totality, Kinsella's hybrid poetics resist a range of totalised narratives which serve to erase differences." What's he getting at? And can you choose something to read again which would perhaps illustrate the point that he's making?
Well, having not read the article, but taking it out of context, if he's talking about generic totalities, what I imagine he means is that, the idea that we can treat something as absolute, that it's just regular, and that we can tell, for example, that book is a book and it's nothing else. And now we know damn well it's something else other than just a book. The idea that narratives can be A, B, C, we can track them through and that's what they mean. Well, of course, we can't know that. Narratives always have kind of shadows and ghosts, if you like. And what he's saying, and I know my work at least well, so I hope this is what he's saying, is that what seems to be straightforward, what seems to be linear, is in fact questionable. That there's always something happening below the surface. I know in Minter's own work, he loves the word palimpsest, and I think that's what he's talking about. The fact that we're palimpsesting, and almost any poem I've ever written could demonstrate that. So I could randomly grab something from Wheatlands, the book done with Dorothy Hewitt, and I could pick it up, and I could, I'll read a short poem. I'll read this one, Love Poem. The title suggests something very particular. A pair of foxes lie in death together untouched by the hunter, an expression of devotion, reductio ad absurdum, like the poor dog starving on the grave of its master, held up as human virtue in an animal. A crop duster crazy in its dive over the hill affects longevity. Silently we share a strange sort of destiny. A pair of foxes lying on straw in the deserted pig shed probably dined on strychnine, a stimulant, an analogy for love. That's a metatextual poem. Essentially, it's about a pair of foxes eating a strychnine bait, dining on it, and dying. Okay. The kind of a generic reading of that would be you could do it within the context of foxes intruding into a landscape and being removed and so on. If you did a paranoid reading of it, you could look at it as being very problematic about what does and doesn't have the right to be in any particular space. Now I'm conscious of all these things, and it's a poem that's actually criticising my writing processes as much as it's making a kind of political judgment about what's going on in the environment or about any other subtext that could be read on that level. So yeah, the narrative is one thing, the potential meaning is another, but the poem defeats them. It's actually critical of myself before it begins. Someone said, Gig Ryan said in a review in The Age on the weekend, that in the long poem from Visitants, the one dedicated to John Tranter, the second last poem in the book, Nature Mort O Rhetoric, that it's a poem that looks at my writing processes and my influences and tries to ward off any criticism by being self-reflective. And he says that it polishes my influences like amulets to protect me. It's entirely true. It's exactly what it does do. But it's playing. The poem starts off and talks about, well, I'm writing this poem, and I show it to someone, and they say, well, it's terrible. Another one says it's great. So I say, some of my friends reckon it's the greatest thing I've done, the worst thing I've done. And it plays for the whole production of the poem all the way through. So on the surface, the linear, the generic surface, that's what it's about. But at the same time, it's playing with the whole way we receive information and the way we process it. And it's about many other different things. It's a poem against vivisection, for example. And the Island of Dr. Moreau's mentioned. It's a poem about how in the media world we live in, it mentions Mike Patton from Faith No More, and whether I can get him into the literary journal I'm editing at that particular time. But Mike's too busy doing a gig off in San Francisco somewhere, that kind of thing. So it's playing with the familiar. So it's about engagement with popular culture as well. He's not simply meaning that the poem is about lots of things. Of course it is, but there's a conscious attempt to undermine the expected narrative. There's a ploy going on. You can read anything into a text, and that's valid, but you can't necessarily plan a poem so that you actually understand that that's what's going on. I think that's what it might mean. Have I made this more confused than it was in the original?
Well, let's switch away to something that we recently experienced. We climbed Yorkokine Rock north of Tamman in the wheat belt, a monolith, a huge monolith rock, and we looked out over those surrounding farmlands, the wheatlands, and the remnant scrub there. Impressions?
Oh, it was one of those little moments in your life that you remember that will be a point of reference for me forever. Sitting on the end of Deepwater Point Genty on the on the Canning River, or sitting on the farm looking out at the Needlings Hill at a particular point in your life. It was one of those, and the reason it was because it took me entirely by surprise. You are suddenly in looking at a landscape that, when you're on ground level, seems to be very straightforward. You're quite elevated on Yorkokine Rock. Becomes a whole world. Also, it's a place that disturbed me deeply because it was heavily graffitied, and it's this wonderful waving rock. And deeply, is this popular culture meeting nature? No, I don't think so. It's just mindless vandalism. I mean, it had no cultural value whatsoever. It was just defacement. I love Benny, or I love Julie, or whatever, with a few sort of chunks knocked out of the rock. And the kind of vandalism of the rock surface really bothered me generally. So it's a moment of great beauty when I just thought, wow, this is special. And obviously a recognition of incredible sacred importance it has to Indigenous people. You can obviously sense that. Of course it would have. But at the same time, deep trauma about mindless vandalism that had gone on there, and total destruction of the environment, and the fact that this is all that's left in the sea of wheatland or of farming territory. So it was a place of great distress and great joy simultaneously. They're those defining moments in life, aren't they? I should add, when I said that Peter's words implied that Peter's words were confusing, his words aren't confusing at all. Just my expression of them was.
Well, SALT is an international journal now, which you and Tracy Ryan founded many years ago. It's now had more than 12 issues. And you also, I think, founded SALT Folio Press. The word salt seems to be something quite central, almost iconographic to you, John. Can you explain?
Oh, it is. It's entirely... one thing about the founding of the journal, Tracy actually came into the journal in 1996. It was founded in the late 80s. The first issue came out in 1990, so it was actually around before Tracy came in. But Tracy came in at a point where it was not happening. And she injected a huge amount of life into it, and she looked after all the kind of typesetting and stuff like this. So she's been very pivotal. She's no longer part of the journal, in fact. She stopped on the issue before this one. So she was around for about 4 issues. I mean, she's still around in my life, obviously, but in terms of actually being involved in the journal, and she's no longer part of SALT Press. She was instrumental in 4 books that we did, and quite a few pamphlets. But now the press is actually run by a group of people. I'm the commissioning editor, so it's become, you know, a more, I suppose, non-profit making commercial concern, if you can work that out. But you know, we're doing 20 books over the next year. We'll do each year. The first 4 of this cycle have just come out. But the name SALT literally comes from our family background of actually my auntie and uncle's farm, the family farm, if you like, the place I spent a lot of my childhood visiting and on and so on, was deeply affected by salinity. And they spent 30 years, they've spent 30 years reclaiming the area lost by salt, by planting trees. And one of the first people to actually do this in a systematic way. And this day tonight, in 1969, went out and made a program on it, that kind of thing. Really interesting background. Well, so I'm told anyway. I can't remember being there when the TV crew was there, but apparently they did. So salt becomes a symbol for 2 things. It's desolation, but also the beauty of desolation, because salt, you know, as a kid I found incredibly beautiful and magical. I used to love going out in the salt flats and so on, through the gullies. And I know it wasn't the right thing to do, but I found it really magical. But it's also, but it's desolation. I mean, it just destroys, or is the result of destruction, I should say, more appropriately. But it's also the sustainer of life, because, you know, the human body requires at least a certain amount, even if it's infinitesimal, of salt. So that contradiction appeals to me, and everything I write is about overcoming contradiction or engaging with contradiction. Walt Whitman once said, you know, do I contradict myself? Well, then I contradict myself, and I think that's one of the great lines. So it's that sort of combination of things, that contradiction. Interestingly enough, when the first issue came out, I received a letter from the old editors of the original Salt Journal, which came out in the Second World War. Mungo McCallum and people like this wrote a letter signed by the 4 editors, who were all still alive then. They're not now, of course. I think 2 have died. Saying that, you know, what are you doing with the name? It's our name. And I wrote back saying, well, I've just said basically to you that this is why. And they wrote back to me a lovely letter, which is in one of the library collections now, saying that they thought that was a good reason to have a journal called Salt, and they had no problem. But you'll notice that in the front of the journal, in every issue, there's a little disclaimer that says, this publication has no connection nor intends to bear resemblance to the Australian Army Education Service magazine, Salt, September 1941 to April 1946. And being a pacifist and not very military-minded, shall we say, that suits me just fine.
Yes, well, I well remember reading the original Salt, but I'm glad that both salts exist.
Oh, I am too. You know, the other Salt, you know, was very important in the context of the war and so on to be an outlet. So I have nothing but respect for it. I'm just saying that, you know, the psychology this one comes out of is entirely different. Yeah.
Would you like to read us something of your work where you use salt as a motif? Oh,
sure. I mean, salt's in so much of what I write. Maybe from here. You see, the funny thing is that, in fact, I'll read a poem directly about salt. That's an idea. That's actually literally about salt. So much. It occurs in poem after poem after poem. But I will actually read one that specifically engages with it as a subject, if you like. If I can find it here. I'll read something from Eschatologies. It's called Pillars of Salt.
Yes, I know.
We always look back attracted by that feeling of having been there before, the road sinking, the soil weeping, scab on scab lifted, fences sunk to gullies, catching the garbage of paddocks, strainers blocked by stubble and machinery, and the rungs of collapsed rainwater tanks, and maybe the chimney and fireplace of a corroded farmhouse, once the guts of the storm, now a salty trinket. The salt is a frozen waste in a place too hot for its own good. It is the burnt-out core of Earth's eye, the excess of white blood cells. The ball and chain rides lushly over its polishing surface. Even deadwood whittles itself out of the picture. Salt crunches like sugar glass, the sheets lifting on the soles of shoes. Thongs scatter pieces beyond the hope of repair. Finches and flies quibble on the thick fingers of salt bushes. A dugite spits blood into the brine. An Air Force trainer jet appears. The Mantis pilot, dark-eyed and wire-jawed, sets sight on the white waste for a strafing run. Diving, pulling out abruptly, refusing to consummate. Salt explodes silently with the animation of an inorganic life. A sheep's skull no more than its signature. Refugees already climbing towards the sun on pillars of salt. That line about refugees is particularly important to me because, of course, I'm a very pro-immigration person, and yet I have obviously great tension and respect for Indigenous presence, and we're all migrants if we're not Indigenous, and how these two often conflicting points of view work together always subtext itself. I say subtext itself because it exists in language as well, in even a poem about salt.
Well, and finally, John, in the context of the International Centre for Landscape and Language, there obviously are some particular locations in the Western Australian landscapes which are most important to you. Would you care to name them and perhaps even conclude with a poem which illustrates those most important landscapes?
Within the landscapes of Western Australia, there's obviously York. That's the key. That's where the family is. That's where half of my brain is, if you like. At least my soul is. I have problems with saying that, but there is a restlessness about the place. That's maybe the best way of putting it. The Swan River and the Canning River, because I lived a lot by them as a child. So I went to school, except for 3 years, I went to school in the country in Geraldton. I did my schooling in the city. So I feel very strongly about that. And that's where I used to go when I was in the city to escape, to get close to nature, to use that cliche. The southwest, the forests of Western Australia obviously have a big effect on me, especially around Pemberton. And Albany's another place that's important. Geraldton, I lived there for 3 years. Williams and Narrogin, I lived on and off on a farm outside of Williams with my brother for quite a few years, moving between the city and the country. So I'd spend, say, 3 days in the country and 4 days in the city, or 4 days in the country, depending on the state of my relationship at the time. So there was a kind of movement there. Dryandra Forest. We lived on the edge of Dryandra Forest, used to walk in it every day. So huge influence. Then interestingly enough, our journeys out into out to Lake Grace and out to Southern Cross, even though comparatively recent, have also become kind of landmarks for me, points of discovery, and I remember them with great affection even now. So I think they've become significant as well. Those kind of journeys, if you like. So they're not specific places as much as movements. So I'd say they're the significant places. A few places around Geraldton as well. When I was a kid, a place called Drummond's Point, which is a kind of cove with some incredible reefs and so on, just outside of Geraldton. Also Kelbarry is important, and various places around there. Yeah.
And maybe something very brief to read to
conclude. In that context, let me think about. I'll read something about a very different place. I'm well, I'm probably best known for is writing about the wheat belt, but I've also written poems about very, very different spaces. And maybe I'll find one of those. For example, I've written about Albany quite a bit. I've written about the fringe areas of Perth because I lived in up at Kelmscott at the base of Clifton Hills for a couple of years, or for a year and a half, or a couple of years anyway. And I write a lot about those kind of fringe areas. So maybe I'll find a down south poem or a fringe poem, whichever comes up first. Okay, then I'll read an Augusta poem. Augusta's another place that, as a child, because I used to go down with family on those classic down south journeys. This is called Skippy Rock, Augusta, warning the undertow. 1. Oyster catchers scout the tight rutilic beach. Rust charting runoff locked cross rock up coast from the bolted lighthouse where two oceans surge and rip and meet. 2. Immense the deep lift seizes in Niles and sweeps straight up and built of granite. A black lizard rounds and snorts the froth capillaried up towards dry land's limestone, hillside bone marrow mapped by water. Meta-wrought, the lighthouse distantly elevates and turns the crazily bobbing history of freak waves and wrecks, wrought iron and lead paint brewing deep in capsized sea lanes, talking shop in thick clots of language, bubbles thundering topwards. 3. The stab holes of fishing poles, small boy whipping those gate-crashing waves, releasing shoals of wrecked cuttlefish, bleeding sepia like swell prizing the weed-swabbed rocks and darkly crescented beach. Crab claw and limpet scuttlebutt about the rubbery swathes of kelp. Tenebrous lash of filigree canopy of dust spray, undertow of night. In the context of that Peter Minter quote, he's also talking about the grand narratives, psychoanalysis and so on and so on. That and how unstable they really are, and that what I'm trying to do is work against them. That poem is a psychological engagement with place in the sense of revisiting a childhood memory as an adult and finding it not the way you remembered it. That the terror that was there as a kid, which because it was so immense, was a different terror to that one you had as an adult. So there's a kind of undermining of the grand narrative there.